I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures.
My fellow citizens, let no one doubt that this is a difficult and dangerous effort on which we have set out. No one can foresee precisely what course it will take.
Picture this. You are an American citizen. It's 1945 and your country just deployed the sun over Japan. Then they signed a peace treaty, and a few months back the USSR took Berlin. And this all led to the end of the bloodiest conflict in human history, World War II.
After Karl Germany ran out of gas and were defeated at the Battle of Stalingrad, the gears of the entire war began to shift in reverse.
And after all of that death and destruction, you would probably be thinking that the world would go into a time of peace, you know? After World War II, and won, by the way. How can anyone ever want any more war? Today's video is sponsored by Aura. Spam calls and texts are something that I always get, and I don't like it, and it makes me really upset. Just the other day, I got this ridiculous phishing text claiming I won a cruise. Yeah, right! One reason we get so many of these text and spam calls is because big companies cannot keep our data safe. Look at AT&T. Holy, or Ticketmaster. 560 million users. It's a nightmare. Nightmare! At best, it leads to more spam. At worst, it leads to your identity being stolen and you becoming a victim of fraud. Thank you to today's sponsor, Aura. It sends me fraud alerts quickly if someone tries to use my data to access any of my accounts. I get them sometimes. It also, on my behalf, removes my information from data broker sites, which reduces spam tenfold. Aura also offers transaction monitoring, a VPN, and parental controls, identity theft insurance, anything. It's all in one app at an affordable price. My info is compromised by Ticketmaster or AT&T, which it absolutely was for both. I don't really give a shit because I've got Aura, keeping my back safe, keeping my hind end clear. Don't leave yourself or your family vulnerable. Go to aura.com/Oompa. They are a long-term sponsor of the show. If you click my link, which is in the description, you'll get 14 days for free. Thank you so much for watching this video, and thank you to Aura for supporting the channel. Unfortunately for you, the person who I'm talking to, who's picturing what I'm saying, that reality does not come true, still hasn't come true, and the US and the Soviet Union would enter another war almost immediately after the end of World War II. The craziest war that had ever occurred up until that point. Now, I will say, no actual battles took place, but there were a series of covert operations, propaganda campaigns, and plenty of nuclear threats to get us all tickled, to get us all tight, to get us all puckered, to get us all scared, really. Not all us, I guess. I was born in 1996, and the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991.
This is a victory for democracy and freedom. It's a victory for the moral force of our values.
So I guess I'm just a poser. All these threats, all this propaganda, all these covert operations were to get the upper hand or get the other person or entity, I guess, to be scared enough to surrender and give up and go back home with your tail between their legs. I already mentioned that the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, but the Cold War lasted for about 50 years. And it's impossible to tell how long it would have actually lasted or what exactly could have happened had the USSR not collapsed. That being said, if you look at the geopolitical situation today, we're basically in the same situation. Am I right, guys? Share if you agree.
The US declared at a NATO summit in Washington earlier this month that it will begin deploying the missiles in 2026.
But now it isn't just big bad Russia, it's big bad China and also big bad Russia.
To cover the attackers, Alperovich says, China would strike Taiwan's defenses from afar.
In today's video, we're going to be talking about some of the shit that has gone down between the United States and the USSR, and in general, democracy versus communism.
In the background was the growing struggle between two great powers to shape the post-war world.
And we're going to show you guys how determined the US was to preserve democracy during the Cold War. Communist regimes during the Cold War massacred millions of civilians. In the Soviet Union, China, and Cambodia, governments initiated radical social transformation programs, killing, torturing, or even just starving groups that they saw as hostile to their system, or just they thought they were unworthy of life. I'm not sure. A lot of genocides though, a lot of evil, a lot of bad men. The communist regimes that took part in these horrible atrocities were driven by ideologies of selective extermination, and they pretty much all the time ignored the moral implications of their actions. Moral implications, moral relativism or whatever. And all them commies seem to support each other, and they did that Spider-Man meme, and then they were like, oh, that's legitimacy for these mass killings because they're like us, they're also doing it. Let's just kill people who we don't like en masse. A lot of the evil regimes during the Cold War believed that eliminating opposition was purely necessary for revolutionary goals, purely necessary to instill the values and the ideologies that their governments were based on. You have to kill a lot of people to get the point across, unfortunately. Or at least that's what they thought. Entire communities of people were wiped out based on perceived threats to visions of progress, communistic visions of progress. Thank you, bald guy from late 1800s, and other guy who was his protege. The terror during the Cold War was relentless, and the suffering was immense. And even after moving away from systemic extermination, which a lot of these governments did, the regimes continued to commit atrocities. The Soviet Union's brutal actions in Afghanistan and the horrific 1989 Beijing massacre by the Chinese government, which was right before the collapse of the Soviet Union, and so was Afghanistan, by the way.
Tiananmen Square, Beijing, 1989. The Chinese government sends tanks into the square, shooting at unarmed civilians and students. An abrupt end to political reforms that once brought people so much hope.
And I'm not saying that we are much better, but at least we pretend to be. I don't want to hear it, okay, guys? I'll make a different video for democratic atrocities. All right? Jeez. But yeah, Afghanistan and the Chinese Tiananmen Square Beijing massacre are prime examples of ongoing disregard for human life even after the Cold War began to sort of become less terrible, because it started off really bad, and then the 70s was terrible. I mean, there was an actual genocide in the 70s. It seemed like ideological solidarity was a big time problem amongst communist governments. They often turned a blind eye to each other's crimes and further entrenched their power, which extended the suffering of millions for a very long time, guys. Share if you find this surprising. So now on to the meat of the video. We're gonna be talking about a couple operations, maybe some crazy science that went down in the Cold War, and also my friend Manic Cadence is going to be joining me on this video. He's got 2 little chapters in this big ass long thing. If you guys wanna see more content between me and Manic Cadence, more videos like this, press the like button down below, and also subscribe to Manic Cadence.
The rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War fueled an arms race like never before seen on Earth. We might associate this with atomic weapons, but it wasn't just that. There was a race to scientific dominance, engineering dominance, rocketry dominance. It didn't stop. And if we're being honest, no one but the military-industrial complex likes the idea of war or preparing for one, but it pushed both countries to be something that they could never have been without each other. And now that atomic weapons were on the table, the US and the Soviet Union were both so desperate to achieve scientific and technological dominance that they would both do nearly anything to get a leg up on one another. So as World War II was coming to an end, there was a secret scramble to gobble up all that juicy Nazi science that made Germany such a domineering force. As Allied troops pushed through Nazi-occupied territory at the end of the war, groups like the Combined Intelligence Objective Subcommittee followed in the wake of the front lines to snatch up any documents or equipment tied to the Nazi war machine. As military bases and research facilities were captured by Allied forces, scientists were being interrogated to give up all of their Nazi secrets. And it was during this campaign that the Allied forces trailing behind the front lines found something that would make their job a little easier, a little bit more efficient. A comprehensive cataloged list of scientists and engineers who had worked on the Third Reich's behalf, the Olsenberg list. And this valuable little who's who of Nazi scientists and engineers was never meant to be found. In a desperate hurried attempt to get rid of it, somebody had jammed it down a toilet at Bonn University. It was packed with all the hate, girth, and density of an oversized heroin shit that you can't flush down, and that's why the Allied forces were able to find it. And as America flipped through the pages of notable and useful scientists that they saw before them, they had an idea. What if they could grab up the best Nazi minds and use them to bolster their own position in the growing conflict with the Soviet Union? I mean, sure, the whole world had just fought to keep Nazis and their ideas from coming across sovereign borders, but why not just bring Nazis and their ideas home? It was no secret that Hitler had heavily focused on technology and science to galvanize his military strength. He was quick to reward his best minds financially and with positions of power. But now these men were scrambling to get out of the way of the war that they had supported with their scientific prowess, and would be desperate to avoid being brought to justice by military tribunals, international trials like the Nuremberg trials, or worse, tortured and killed by groups of vigilante Nazi hunters. Immunity, and safety for that matter, was a gigantic bargaining chip, and they could offer the most valuable Nazi thinkers complete immunity and a chance to continue their scientific pursuits in America. Like a Catholic confession with a creepy old priest, the US could wipe away their sins, and at the same time, they'd be keeping those same scientific juggernauts away from the Soviet Union. Now, it was obviously a bad look to pardon and then hire the enemy and the perpetrators of the Holocaust and its horrors, but the risks of leaving them for the Soviets proved too much, so America would just conduct its recruitment quietly. The U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff officially established Operation Overcast on July 20th, 1945. It would be overseen by the newly formed Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, JIOA, and carried out by special agents in the Army's Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, with the express purpose of acquiring anybody that they felt could advance U.S. rocketry or help develop chemical or biological weapons. They also scoured for Krauts that had an advanced knowledge of synthetic fuels, medicine, and many other fields of research. And don't get soft on me, these are Nazis, and I can say Krauts, because I'm part German. Have you ever had sauerkraut? It's fucking great. Operation Overcast would come to be known as it is today in November 1945, when the name was changed in practice to Operation Paperclip. The name comes from Ordnance Corps officers who, when scanning through details of German rocketry experts, would add them to their wish list by adding a paperclip to their file, signaling their desire to hire. When President Truman officially sanctioned the operation, he restricted Nazi members and active Nazi supporters from being considered for immunity. But the JIOA and the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS, who would become the CIA, ignored this exemption and did themselves a deep state. By this, of course, I mean make secret, consequential decisions that they are not authorized to make, bypassing authority and oversight to effectively run the country unelected and unaccountable. Thank God that's not a problem anymore. Instead, they would take actions to erase any incriminating evidence of war crimes from the Nazi scientists' records, whitewashing them into immunity for their sins. And with that pesky little presidential roadblock out of the way, the US government was able to import and employ more than 1,600 German scientists, technicians, and engineers between the years of 1945 and 1959. Along with their families, over 6,000 Germans with ties to the Third Reich made their way to the US. And as an American, you can be disgusted by this, but just know that the checks and balances put into place to keep these things from happening were completely overlooked and ignored. But still, looking back on Operation Paperclip, I'm conflicted, torn between morality and practicality. On one hand, the fact that these men used their God-given talents while serving the Third Reich is absolutely unforgivable. Following orders is no excuse for knowingly aiding in a genocidal world dominance tour. And though they weren't soldiers or military leaders, these intellectual assets happily accepted the financial benefits and societal notoriety that came with their work, at least up until the time that their cowardly Führer swallowed the muzzle of his own weapon while hiding in his bunker. These turncoats deserve only the horrors that they helped bring upon the rest of the world, and then to be sorted by their creator later. On the other hand, however, there were growing Cold War tensions tied to a nuclear arms race producing unimaginable weapons. If America hadn't taken action, the Soviet Union would have been glad to rescue as many Nazi scientists from justice as possible and put them to work against the West. In fact, the Soviets had their own paperclip called Operation Overcast. And don't come at me with that pronunciation shit, I don't give a fuck what they called it. And yeah, I got Russian blood in me too, but I don't know what the fuck they're saying. Anyhow, their operation had the upper hand. Geographically and logistically speaking, it was far easier for them to move those in the European theater of war to the Soviet homeland, which is how Operation Ossewaken was able to move 2,200 of their own strategically advantageous Nazis and their families in a single night. Love it or hate it, Operation Paperclip would prove to be a huge asset going forth in the Cold War and the following space race with the Soviet Union. The scientists and knowledge acquired by America was valued at $10 billion in patents and industrial processes, and that's in 1940s and 50s money. The most noteworthy Nazi championed by the US would be Werner von Braun, and this was a big get for the US. Von Braun would be a part of the Nazi all-star team if there was one. He was all in with their ideas, being a card-holding member of the Nazi Party and the Allgemeine SS. But what he offered the Germans was a lot more than loyalty. As an aerospace engineer and space architect, he created the V-2 rocket under Hitler's leadership during World War II, the first long-range guided ballistic missile that the world had ever seen. After the scientific exodus of Germany, he and the team that he'd brought over through Operation Paperclip worked on a ballistic missile project for the US Army and developed the rocket that launched the US's first space satellite in 1958. Just 2 years later, his group of Nazi scientists would be merged into NASA, and he would become the director of the new Marshall Space Flight Center and the chief architect of the Saturn V launch vehicle that would send Apollo astronauts to the moon, if you believe that. In effect, we owe many of NASA's greatest accomplishments to a Nazi. Knowing what kind of backlash it would receive, Operation Paperclip was very much a clandestine operation, being largely hidden from the American population during its execution and the immediate years following. The program remained classified for many years, and while the details of America's top picks of the Nazi draft were not supposed to be disclosed until many years later, but it became hard to hide when the accomplishments of these men became the source of American pride, especially in the 1970s and 80s, when it sparked controversy and criticism. I leave it to you to form your own opinion on Operation Paperclip, because it reflects the complexities of the Cold War geopolitics and the lengths that the US and the USSR were willing to go to maintain technological superiority. It's a tough choice, and definitely not a decision that I'd want to make or be responsible for, which is probably why I make videos instead of policy, and play Monday morning quarterback from the safety of YouTube.
Operation Paul Bunyan is one of the most bizarre confrontations in history, and it was between North Korea and the US with South Korea, and it was all over a tree. That's right, guys. This confrontation is about a tree.
Standing at 80 feet tall, it obstructed the view of a checkpoint at the mouth of the Bridge of No Return, the most volatile area of the Korean demilitarized zone.
Operation Paul Bunyan. Pretty funny, isn't it? He's Paul Bunyan! He chops trees! Said tree blocked a crucial line of sight near the DMZ, which caused a significant issue for the UNC, or United Nations Command. On August 18th, 1976, just 11 days before my birthday, I was born in 1976, a team led by Captain Arthur Boniface went to prune the tree. Brave. Very bold. All right, guys, look at that tree. Captain Boniface's team included Captain Kim and First Lieutenant Mark Barrett and 11 other enlisted personnel, both from the United States and South Korea. Due to the rules of the Joint Security Area, or JSA, as we will now be referring to it as, they were unarmed. They only carried mattocks to prune the tree. So these fellas showed up to prune that tree, and shortly after, 15 North Korean soldiers appeared from nowhere, and they ordered them to stop. Captain Boniface, adhering to his orders, ignored them, obviously, because he doesn't give a shit about what the North Koreans say, and they continued the pruning operation. The defiance prompted Lieutenant Pak Chul, also known as the Bulldog by UNC troops due to previous aggressive encounters, to take drastic measures. Bulldog sent a runner across the Bridge of No Return, which looks like this, pretty crazy, to call for reinforcements, and within minutes, a truck arrived with 20 more North Korean soldiers armed with crowbars and clubs. Lieutenant Pak Chul then did something that would escalate the situation fairly dramatically, I suppose. He removed his watch from his wrist, carefully wrapped it in a handkerchief, placed it in his pocket, and screamed, "Kill the bastards!" And this marked the beginning of a brutal assault. The North Korean soldiers attacked the unarmed UNC personnel. They bludgeoned Captain Boniface to death with their clubs, and First Lieutenant Mark Barrett was also killed in the ensuing chaos. And you might notice as well, this is 1976, 20 years after the end of the Korean War. Not a good thing to kind of restart a war over a tree. The attackers quickly loaded the bodies into their truck and fled the scene.
Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State responsible for the aggressive bombing campaign during the Vietnam War, urged the president for an attack on the North Korean barracks to capture the bloody killers.
And the incident, later known as the Korean axe murder incident, sent shockwaves through the ranks of the US and South Korean military. You think you'd probably have heard about this. I had never heard about this until researching this video. The Korean axe murders. The what? That sounds like a cool metal band. Are you telling me people died? Innocent people died over a fucking tree? The immediate aftermath was a scramble to understand what had just happened and how the fuck to respond. The response obviously needed to be swift and decisive, but also measured to avoid a full-scale war like the one that they just ended. The US and South Korea's response was nothing short of spectacular, in all honesty. Thinking about it almost gives me goosebumps. Almost! I'm not that simple, all right? We came together and we devised Operation Paul Bunyan, a show of overwhelming force designed to send a clear message to North Korea without escalating into a full-blown conflict. On August 21st, 1976, just 3 days after the attack, a massive convoy was sent to the JSA. The convoy included 23 American and South Korean vehicles with 2 teams of 8 men armed with, guess, chainsaws to cut down the tree, okay? Because the tree, we lost 2 men, but the tree is still a problem. You get out of here, you little dumbass. She's a communist sympathizer. The chainsaw teams obviously needed to be protected. They were protected by 2 30-man security platoons armed with pistols and axe handles. Additionally, Company B was on standby with a detonation system to blow up the Freedom Bridge if necessary. I love the names of the bridges, dude. The Bridge of No Return, the Freedom Bridge. Guess which one's on which side? They also had a 64-man task force trained in Taekwondo, very South Korean of them, initially armed with clubs and later equipped with M16s and M79 grenade launchers to, match any sort of escalation that might potentially happen. Also, the air support was just as impressive. There were 20 utility helicopters and 7 Cobra attack helicopters that hovered nearby. Beyond that, we had B-52 Stratofortresses escorted by US F-4 Phantom IIs that flew in the air as a show of American dominance.
Our military should not be mistaken for a cable news gabfest show. We have been honed into a machine of lethal moving parts that you would be wise to avoid if you know what's good for you.
And some South Korean F-5s and F-86 fighters that were on alert and ready to go as well, I guess. Not as cool as the Stratofortress, but pretty cool still. Now, this sheer display of force had the intention of being intimidating. Let's intimidate North Korea into feeling bad. It worked, guys. It worked. North Korea responded with approximately 150 to 200 troops armed with machine guns and assault rifles to the scene. And when the UNC began Operation Paul Bunyan, the North Korean troops watched from a distance, a really far distance, clearly outmatched by the overwhelming US and South Korean presence. Operation Paul Bunyan commenced at 0700 hours, and in just 42 minutes, the tree was chopped down. Thank God. All right, guys, bless us. The convoy then swiftly left the area and the mission was accomplished. The only casualty of this massive operation was the tree itself. Of course, that is if you do not include the 2 men who died in the Korean axe murders, all right? I don't mean to laugh. That's incredibly disrespectful. I'm sorry about that. But the way I said it was kind of accidentally funny. I'm sorry. This overwhelming show of force not only removed the tree, but also served as a significant embarrassment to North Korea. They can suck it, all right? 1 L though, because 2 L's makes a double. The North Koreans were forced to back down and later issued a statement of regret for their earlier violence. The entire incident, which started with a tree and escalated to the brink of war, ended with a display of military power that highlighted the tensions and absurdities of the Cold War era. This was all over a tree. A tree. A tree. A tree. 2 people died because of a tree. Operation Paul Bunyan is not only remembered for its immediate and instant insane conflagration and impact, but also for its broader implications. It showcased the extremely delicate balance of power on the Korean Peninsula and the lengths to which nations would go to maintain their positions. The operation also demonstrated the importance of clear communication and overwhelming force in dealing with volatile situations, especially when it's about a tree, all right? In the end, the operation served its purpose. Cool name, cool result. Operation Paul Bunyan, a very powerful reminder that there is a potential for escalation no matter what, even in the most seemingly trivial conflict. Share this with a friend if you found it unbelievable. During the Cold War, there were conflicts all around the world. For example, the conflict in Vietnam. The goal for us in the Vietnam War was to eliminate the red tyranny of communism, hoping to stop the spread from the Soviet Union into Southeast Asia, all right?
There is a war going on in South Vietnam. I think last week there were over 500 killings, assassinations, bombings.
People down there, you got China, you got Cambodia, you got the Korean Peninsula. Like, there's a lot of stuff going on. The Korean War just happened, and we have to stop the red tyrant, the red demon. All right, guys? The red demon. While many people know about the Vietnam War, few know about the horrifying events in Cambodia involving the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot.
From 1975 to 1979, the Khmer Rouge regime cemented themselves as one of the most brutal dictatorships in human history.
It is actually mind-boggling how few people know of Pol Pot and the recent happening of the entire Khmer Rouge genocide. Like, anyways, since North Vietnam was communist and was supported by the Soviets, they were on the wrong side of history, loser! And the US, as you probably could imagine, took drastic measures to ensure victory, regardless of cost. They sought help from Prince Sihanouk of Cambodia. Sorry if I said that wrong, but he wanted to say neutral. All right, guys, he's kind of a Swiss. He's a Swissman. A short while later, though, in 1970, after waiting for too long, the prince was overthrown by his prime minister, Pol Pot, and that gave the US the green light to start bombing the shit out of Cambodia. They targeted North Vietnamese fighters that were crossing the border, and they also killed a lot of Cambodian citizens and Vietnamese refugees as well. Countless. I mean, it's an actual atrocity. In the name of democracy. Democracy Manifest.
Gentlemen, this is Democracy Manifest.
So years later, in 1975, and desperate to regain power, the prince allied with Khmer Rouge. Khmer Rouge is probably a name that you've heard before. Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot, they are bros, basically. He's prime minister. Khmer Rouge is like a gang, like the tunnel snakes from Fallout, if they were giant assholes. Not really a gang, more of a communist regime. But in the meantime, though, the UN and the West saw that a civil war was brewing and some conflict was breaking out, and we held a vote, I guess. Surprisingly, both China and the US, along with Britain, voted to keep the Khmer Rouge in power. The Khmer Rouge led by Prime Minister Pol Pot. By the way, a communist regime. It's like, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. That's where the title card. That's right, guys, the title card. The US funneled funds into Khmer Rouge, reportedly more than $85 million, which is this much money now. All of this in effort to gain favor with China and pull them away from the Soviet Union, because once again, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And you're like, well, how? Why would we want to be friends with China? Don't they suck? Or whatever? Not really. But even back then, they really did. We didn't really know that they were killing birds and stuff, and they had this like big frog leap forward or whatever this guy, Mayo or something, was talking about. I'm not really sure. But supporting Khmer Rouge to get China to move away from the Soviet Union seemed like a really good idea. Unfortunately, though, the Khmer Rouge used this support to commit a horrific genocide, killing 1.5 to 2 million people, nearly 25% of the population of Cambodia at the time, which is fucking insane. And the Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, is one of the most brutal regimes in modern history, specifically one that is not that old and was backed by the United States of America. By the way, in 1975, the White House lobbied Congress for $200 million more to give Khmer Rouge and the Cambodian regime, but luckily, apparently 85 million went. I'm not really sure, but I'm glad more didn't go. The Khmer Rouge's goal was to transform Cambodia into a rural, classless society, the classic communist dream, I guess. They abolished money, private property, and religion. They forced people into labor camps where they faced starvation, overwork, and also execution. Just death, basically. The regime's methods were horrifying and systemic, with killing fields where mass executions took place. People were executed for even the slightest suspicion of dissent or for being deemed unworthy of their life due to their education or profession, which is terrible. I don't really even know what to say. I'm at a loss for words. The conflict didn't end there. After the end of our part of the Vietnam War, Vietnam moved into Cambodia in 1978 to fight against the Khmer Rouge because it was terrible, killing a lot of people. And this led to the Cambodian Cambodian-Vietnamese War partly as revenge for cross-border attacks during the Vietnam War that included the Ba Chuk massacre, where the Khmer Rouge wiped out over 3,000 Vietnamese villagers and contributed to a total of 30,000 Vietnamese killed or tortured by that regime.
From April 18th to 30th, 1977, the Khmer Rouge launched a surprise attack on 13 Vietnamese villages in 8 different provinces. In their 12-day occupation, they massacred the people of the villages, with Ba Chuk village being the hardest hit.
Vietnam managed to end the genocide in just 17 days, but faced massive international backlash. For example, China invaded Vietnam in February of 1979 because they ended the Khmer Rouge regime that they were sponsoring. Oh, so were we. At the same time that all of that happened, the US continued to impose sanctions on Vietnam. In spite of all the atrocities committed by the Khmer Rouge, which is, there's no argument that they did commit them, the US and China preferred to maintain their strategic positions, punishing Vietnam for toppling the genocidal regime. It really just comes down to the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The United States believed that, and China believed that during this time. And they still believe that now, because that's like a foundation of geopolitics. There were many costs in terms of human life in the 70s, but specifically in this case, the strategy that we went with caused the immense suffering of the Cambodian people, which a lot of people just don't know about. So shout out to the US, baby girl. Share this with your friends.
It's not safe to hope for the best without preparing for the worst.
I don't even know any communists. What can I do? Know your enemy.
If he openly declares himself to be a communist, we take his word for it.
Suck my dick. I despise you.
It can't happen here? Well, this is what it looks like if it should.
Operation Paperclip showed just how those in the highest rungs of the military-industrial complex were willing to forego the morality and righteous American values that nearly 420,000 Americans died fighting for in World War II in order to stack their deck against the Soviet Union. Their justification for this could arguably have been valid. The Soviets posed a serious threat to the US as the two rising superpowers with opposing worldviews were breaking new ground in atomic research and weapons development. The USSR was trailing behind, no doubt, but the American lead was a fragile one. Loyalty and allegiance to American dominance domestically was paramount. A spy involved in atomic research could provide the information needed to catch the Soviets up in a matter of months. A traitor in government could hamper domestic policy or foreign affairs. Communists hidden in the entertainment industry might manage to sway the hearts and minds of Americans towards communist sympathies, and those sympathies could convince American laborers to fight the system with unions, threatening to bring a halt to the industrial lifeblood of the nation, slowing production and killing GDP in a time where America needed to be as productive as possible. It was key that Americans were aware of the Red Threat, that they feared it, and that they fought against it. Generally speaking, these ideas became known as the Red Scare, or McCarthyism, named for outspoken anti-communist advocate U.S. Senator Joseph R. McCarthy, was a hysterical overreaction to the threats posed by communism to the U.S. institutions. The ideas behind the Red Scare of the 1940s and 1950s were not, in fact, baseless. They had their roots in the wake of World War I, or the first Red Scare. Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks came to power in 1917 in the Soviet Union during the Russian Revolution, sparking the rise of the Communist Party. Not long after, the US began to see a number of labor strikes, something their opposition blamed on immigrants and sympathizers of communist countries trying to destroy the American way of life. In response to that threat, the Sedition Act of 1918 was passed and targeted radicals, labor union leaders, and anybody who criticized the government. Their civil liberties were tossed out to protect national security, and anybody deemed a threat was subjected to unconstitutional surveillance and threatened with deportation. As harsh as that sounds, there was a legitimate threat because in 1919, a series of targeted bombings against political and law enforcement leaders were carried out by anarchists all over the country, including in Boston, Cleveland, Philly, D.C., and New York City. To protect its citizens and institutions, the U.S. mounted a swift counterattack. Attorney General Alexander Mitchell Palmer carried out what came to be known as the Palmer Raids. Palmer would put a young Justice Department lawyer named J. Edgar Hoover in charge of a small division assigned to gather intelligence on the radical threats. And once he'd gathered his list of targets, he coordinated his team with local law enforcement around the country. And in January of 1920, the operation was a go. Simultaneous raids in major cities across the U.S. were carried out. But because of poor communication, planning, and execution, The Palmer raids proved much less effective than they'd hoped. The overzealous and arguably unconstitutional raids did, however, scare some communists into seeing that their government was willing to break their own laws to bring them down. Both Palmer and Hoover would face public backlash for their decisions to carry out the operation, but as we know, doing a bad job in government work is often rewarded. In 1924, J. Edgar Hoover would become the director of the FBI, and he would stay there until his death in 1972. Flash forward to the 1940s, where J. Edgar Hoover had settled into his role with the FBI, and as an avid anti-communist, he saw the Cold War as another opportunity for communist ideas to poison the American well. Sure, he failed miserably during the first Red Scare, but he now yielded the power of the FBI, and he would use and abuse it. Hoover used his agency to conduct a crusade against the ideas of the enemy and anybody suspected of holding them by any means necessary. He directed the FBI to investigate and surveil suspected communists, anarchists, and any other ideas that he thought were radical or anti-American. Methods including, but not limited to, mail interception and wiretapping were used. Undercover FBI agents also infiltrated communist-affiliated leftist and anarchist groups to identify leadership and take them down from the inside out.
Communism in reality is not a political party. It is a way of life, an evil and malignant way of life. It reveals a condition akin to disease that spreads like an epidemic. And like an epidemic, a quarantine is necessary to keep it from infecting this nation.
Hoover maintained extensive files on individuals and organizations deemed potentially subversive, and he would use these files to exert influence and control over political figures and public perceptions. But Hoover's FBI was not working alone in this effort. His biggest ally in the battle against the commies would be a senator from Wisconsin, Joe McCarthy.
Fighting communists and getting a bit rough with them, Mr. Huey, is un-American, then I must plead guilty to being un-American. Frankly, McCarthyism means calling a man a communist who is later proven to be one.
Between 1950 and 1954, McCarthy became known for his outspoken anti-communist rhetoric and aggressive pursuit of alleged communists. 40-year-old McCarthy was a known drunk, often said to show up to the Senate floor wasted. He also was known to have a loose relationship with the truth, having fabricated most of his own resume. But he was a loud and powerful force in the Senate hall, unafraid to sling insults at his peers. And he'd ran and been elected on one key issue, being anti-communist, and he was going to lean into that as hard as he could. Usually driven by his own paranoia and unsupported by facts, he was not afraid to go after leaders of institutions or even the government itself.
One communist on the faculty of one university is one communist too many. One communist among the American advisors at Yalta was one communist too many. And even if there were only one communist in the State Department, even if there were only one communist in the State Department, that would still be one communist too many.
He was so effective in drumming up the fear that nobody dared speak out against him, for they feared that they would be the next to be labeled a disloyal American. J. Edgar Hoover used his role as the FBI director to stomp all over American civil rights, using systematic surveillance and investigations, while Senator Joe McCarthy's role was marked by public hearings and accusations. McCarthy's anti-communist tirades were the flame that publicly ignited the grinder laid down by Hoover's FBI. The tinder, Together they fueled the Red Scare, fostering an environment of paranoia and distrust during a critical point in the Cold War tensions. Films that were produced and circulated during this era show the atmosphere that they created and encouraged regular citizens to turn in their friends and family if they suspected them to be a threat to the American way.
Through class warfare, race hatred, or religious intolerance, you know that person seeks to rob us of our freedom and destroy our very lives. And we know what to do about it.
And now, gentlemen, no violence, please. Don't throw those bottles. Don't throw those bottles. No! Oh, no!
The man A traitor to his country, known in the Communist Party by the name of Comrade T, is on his way to a new assignment. For the moment, he is bait for bigger game and is being allowed to continue his assignment. You have the ways and means for stopping him and others like him whose names are not yet known.
The communists have a bigger lie, the lie of the dove, their biggest lie of all. At endless rallies, they proclaim it. Peace, peace, a great and a beautiful word, peace. But when the communists mouth it, it means war.
I'm Colonel Foster. I'm going to be your guide for a short tour through the maze of communist propaganda. It's a strange, shadowy world of the doctored photograph, the misquotation, the insinuation, and the lie. Now, some of this material to us is comical. Some of it is tragic. Some of it's weird. Some of it's dull. But all of it has the single purpose of digging the grave of liberty.
The fear and paranoia drummed up during this time had a lasting effect on Americans. It was overkill, no doubt, but there were many legitimate threats to national security that came from the USSR, including foreign agents. Americans working for the Soviet Union as spies, and anarchists who were willing to commit acts of domestic terror. Notably, 12 prominent leaders of the American Communist Party, or the CPUSA, were arrested in July of 1948 for violating the Smith Act, which made it a federal crime to advocate for the overthrow of the US government by force or violence. Not just that, but all 5 of their defense attorneys were given time for contempt of court, and 2 were disbarred. Hoover was disappointed that the intel that his agency collected on all 55 members of the CPUSA's National Committee did not lead to them all being prosecuted, hoping to end the Communist Party in America in one clean sweep. Still, the momentum of the first set of convictions led to more than 100 second-tier members being brought up on charges under the Smith Act as well, many of which found it nearly impossible to find legal representation after what happened to the lawyers of their leadership. These trials led to many prosecutions and decimated the CPUSA, and while the defendants did have many supporters outside the courthouse protesting the trials, the majority of the American public were convinced of the dangers presented by the communists in America and were heavily in support of them being jailed. Eventually, however, the checks and balances put into place by the separation of power of the 3 separate but equal branches of the US government righted this wrong. Many of these convictions were overturned by the US Supreme Court after the Yates decision, which stated that people could only be held accountable for their actions and not their beliefs, essentially throwing out the idea of thought crime. But the FBI wasn't done trying to make their statement, not by a long shot. When they discovered that Whittaker Chambers, an American writer for Time magazine, was actually a Soviet spy, they managed to turn him, creating a double agent and gaining knowledge on Soviet spies that he had worked with in the past, including a former State Department member from the 1930s named Alger Hiss. It was now 1948 and the statute of limitations for espionage had come and gone. But still, Hoover and the federal government couldn't just pass on an opportunity to prove that the communists could easily infiltrate the US government, so they brought him up on charges anyhow. After his own testimony, completely denying the charges, he would be brought up on 2 counts of perjury, one for claiming that he never gave classified documents to Whittaker Chambers, and the second for saying that he never interacted with them after 1936. Alger Hiss was found guilty for 2 charges of perjury and sentenced to 5 years, of which he would serve 3. His case was highly publicized and used by anti-communist advocates such as McCarthy as a prime example of communist infiltration of the highest orders of US government. The FBI also brought down Julius and Ethel Rosenberg in 1951, a couple accused of organizing a ring of agents who worked as spies to feed the Soviet Union atomic secrets. In 1953, they became the only Americans executed, by electric chair no less, for espionage during the Cold War, orphaning their 2 young sons, Michael and Robert. The trial went by quickly, and the haste to turn them into human fuses stirred up much controversy. Their kids were convinced of their parents' innocence, but after digging into evidence deeper as they grew older, they too eventually came to the conclusion that their father was indeed the man that he was accused of being.
My father, however, the evidence is overwhelming that he was involved in espionage, during the 1940s that he and a group of young men took military industrial information and material from the United States during World War II and gave it to the Soviet Union in order to help them defeat the Nazis.
Ethel, however, likely rode the chair lightning unjustly. Her own brother had testified against her, claiming that Ethel had taken all of Julius's notes regarding his espionage operations, but this was later recanted. Her brother said that he was scared for his own family and testified to protect them, showing just how effective the Red Scare had been on the American public. The commie net cast by Hoover's FBI and McCarthy's accusations was a wide one, entangling many innocent Americans who worked in labor unions, the entertainment industry, even politics, trampling their civil liberties and making their lives an absolute hell. The broad overreach was meant to stamp out communist ideas that led to a threat to the American way of life. In 1947, Hoover's FBI, emboldened by McCarthy's ideas, would bring enough evidence to the Un-American Activities Committee to subpoena 41 screenwriters, directors, and producers in order to dig deeper into potential subversive elements in the entertainment industry. Many of these people were on a short list of Hollywood's who's who that were now being forced to testify under oath if they were or had ever been a member of the Communist Party. And if the answer was yes, the House Un-American Activities Committee and the FBI wanted to know who else was a member. 11 of the 41 refused to testify, stating that their First Amendment right gave them the freedom of speech and the freedom of association. But this was still 10 years before the 1957 U.S. Supreme Court's Yates decision that legally affirmed their belief. One of the 11 who saw the writing on the wall fled the country, but the remaining 10 who were still in the grasp of the U.S. government would be convicted for their refusal to speak and given between 6 and 12 months in prison, beginning in 1950. They would become known as the Hollywood 10, and after they got out of prison, every one of them would be blacklisted from the industry. If they did manage to find work, they would have to do so under a pseudonym or receive no credit at all. The Red Scare's influence over Hollywood wouldn't end there. In 1952, they went after Charlie Chaplin, famous silent film actor, filmmaker, and band mustache bearer, for his alleged communist sympathies. On a trip out of the United States in 1952, he was barred from re-entering, and would later be forced to settle down in Switzerland. These and many other Americans would face personal and professional repercussions due to the anti-communist Red Scare that gripped America in the early 1950s. And while the Cold War and the fears associated with it would carry on for decades, the political propaganda and paranoia that came with the Red Scare, though powerful, was short-lived. The domestic consequences of the Red Scare would begin to dwindle within the next couple years. Senator McCarthy's unsubstantiated drunken tirades eventually led to his censure by the Senate in 1954. His peers and the American public had grown exhausted of his fear-mongering witch hunts, and the dubious persecution of many public figures began to swing the pendulum in the other direction. This was only reinforced by the 1957 Yates Supreme Court decision that I mentioned earlier, which narrowed the definition of membership in the Communist Party. Public figures both within and outside of the U.S. government began to advocate strongly for the right to free speech and the right to dissent. And as more information became available about those who were targeted by the Red Scare, it became evident that many of the accusations during the Red Scare were based on over-exaggerations, misinterpretations, or absolute falsehoods, severely damaging the credibility of those anti-communist advocates that pushed for it all. By the late 50s and early 60s, focus of American foreign policy shifted towards other concerns such as the Cold War arms race and civil rights movement. International affairs also helped quell the Red Scare, such as the Soviet Union's suppression of the Hungarian Revolution in 1956 and the conclusion of the Korean War in 1953, which reduced fears of communist expansion into Asia, a major talking point for the anti-communist sentiment during the early 50s. The Red Scare faded away and McCarthyism lost momentum. Legal protections were reaffirmed, public opinion shifted, and geopolitical priorities evolved, marking the end of one of the most intense periods of political paranoia and suppression of free speech in American history.
Another petty story that draws some similar feelings to Operation Paul Bunyan is the tale of Rockall, an actual useless landmass that stands 56 feet tall and around 163 miles off the coast of Sowe Kilda, or whatever. The island, been known for hundreds of years, was first recorded on the 8th of July, 1810 by the HMS Edmund. However, in 1955, this miserable rock was annexed by the British Crown, who literally had nothing better to do than to claim land for their slowly dying empire.
When the helicopter had landed the men, the Union flag was duly hoisted in the name of the Queen. Only 4 previous landings have been recorded on Rockall.
Rest in peace, amorphous blob. A brass plaque was added to the island and the flag was hoisted tall, inscribed with the classic, "By the authority of Her Majesty!" Mind you, no one had laid claim to this rock for hundreds of years. It only protruded 56 feet above sea level, so why would anyone care about a useless 56-foot tall rock called Rockall? Well, guys, during the Cold War, our friends needed a place to test fire their first nuclear-capable guided nuclear weapon missile thing, the US Corporal missile. This missile could carry a nuclear warhead or high explosive or even a chemical warhead with a range of 75 nautical miles, and the island was the perfect place for the test. There were no Soviet spies or radar able to pick up anything this far out at sea. It's quite literally in the middle of nowhere. It's a rock in the middle of fucking nowhere. But if the Soviets had this landmass, they could set up shop temporarily and easily attack Europe and use Rockall to stage their foray into the EU. So Rockall, in spite of being a tiny and incredibly insignificant piece of rock, had some strategic value in the Cold War. Days have passed since then. It fell off, quite literally. Its location, like mentioned, is the ideal spot for covert or secret military operations. But what's funny is the Wikipedia page of the Rockall rock is absurdly fucking long, and the page details nothing. It's so annoying. This includes people arguing about the island and wanting it free from British hands. It's almost comical how much attention the stupid rock has received over the years. The debates, the disputes, all over Rockall are a perfect example of how fucking dumb human beings are and how we can turn the most trivial shit into grandiose issues with huge Wikipedia pages. Kind of like Operation Paul Bunyan, but like a little bit more cringe and also British. I cannot think of a more pathetic piece of rock in any part of the world. This is the only rock that I know of, and it is incredibly pathetic. The fact that anyone at all would ever want to lay claim to it really shows the desperation that people had during the Cold War. And the British, their decision to annex Rockall was more about making a statement than about the actual value of the rock, I think. That seems to be where I'm leaning and how I'm interpreting this situation.
Well, at least we're not getting slaughtered in mathematics class.
It was about showing dominance and control in a time of global tension. By the way, if the island itself, these images, and this Wikipedia page hadn't yet convinced you of its fucking misery, in The Lord of the Flies, William Golding used this island as a metaphor for the human condition. If you're not familiar with Lord of the Flies, it is literally about stranded children killing each other. Golding's use of Rockall in his novel speaks volumes about the island's desolate and harsh nature. People were so obsessed with the British, the Crown, owning this rock that multiple people tried living on it. First was Tom McLean. He stayed for 40 days. Then another man, Nick Hancock, lasted 45 days. These modern castaways endured the elements to make a point about Rockwall's ownership and significance. Hey, guess what? Who cares, dipshit? Look at this fucking thing. It sucks. This thing sucks. To be fair, though, their stints on the rock were more than just simple Mr. Beast survival challenges. They were political statements during a turbulent time. Also, some people are upset because it's a landmark important for fishermen. The Irish government never actually recognized British ownership of the rock, and they continually tried to fish there despite the British owning it. I don't know. The fishing rights around Rockall have been a point of contention, along with who owns it. For some reason, who cares? This adds another layer to the onion of complexity in this strange territorial dispute. Pettiness has no limit. All right, guys? It has no limit, and it still didn't in the fucking Cold War. We use that bitch to test missiles, corporal missiles. Share this with a friend. This is where things get a bit more Cold War, okay? A bit more interesting. After World War II ended, the world entered the nuclear age, with the United States of America and the Soviet Union dumping millions and billions of dollars into nuclear technologies to ensure that they could annihilate each other if necessary. MAD, mutually assured destruction. Never has there ever been a time in human history where two giant parties spent more money and time trying to figure out how to kill each other if the other one tries to kill you first. Or maybe they did. I don't know what Carthage was up to. Within this lie many different nuclear fumbles. One such nuclear fumble was the United States experimentation with the Demon Core. The Demon Core, by the way, if you haven't heard of it, if you've been living under a large lead spherical dome like Patrick, but with radiation instead of sadness. This core was a 14-pound sphere of plutonium that was 3.5 inches in diameter, the same plutonium that was used in early atomic bombs. The particular core was being prepared to be shipped to Bikini Atoll for Operation Crossroads, where the US was testing the effects of atomic bombs on warships.
Lashed to the decks of ships are samples of military supplies and equipment. Airplanes, jeeps, trucks, and tanks, themselves targets on target ships. Animals were placed aboard some of the ships to substitute for military personnel. A study of their future life history will provide invaluable information.
Fun fact, footage from Operation Crossroads was used in some episodes of SpongeBob SquarePants to show explosions. Bikini Bottom supposedly takes place below Bikini Atoll. Fun little fact, I guess. The core was being produced and maintained and molested at the Los Alamos laboratory in New Mexico. It was kept in a stable state there. However, the stability did not last. Of course, humans meddle. The first Demon Core incident occurred very soon after the Demon Core even came into existence. This happened on August 21st, 1945, when scientist Harry Cricor Daglian Jr. was working alone and he accidentally dropped a neutron reflective tungsten carbide brick onto the core, which caused a massive chain reaction and released a deadly amount of radiation. It looks something like this. I cannot imagine being involved in that. That has to be really quite scary, to be honest. I can't imagine dropping one rock onto another rock and then you die 25 days later. Harry died 25 days later from acute radiation syndrome at the age of 24 years old. He was 24. A security guard nearby, Robert J. Hemmerly, also died 33 years later of acute myelogenous leukemia. I don't know if that's how it's called. Myelogenous. I'm not sure how it's called, how it's pronounced. I don't know how it works. But yeah, it was bad. It was a travesty. 2 people's deaths are linked to that first Demon Core accident. The second accident or incident happened just 9 months later on May 21st, 1946. Physicist Louis Alexander Slotin was performing an experiment that required shims to be placed between the 2 halves of the Demon Core to allow neutrons to escape and keep the core below criticality. Here's a little animation of how the Demon Core is supposed to behave and act. And look at that, it's pretty cool. Neutrinos? What the fuck's that? It always reminded me of cereal. I don't know why. But Mr. Slotin, instead of following protocol, not even an entire year after the first accident, he used a screwdriver to separate the halves. Genius. The screwdriver slipped, causing the reflector to fall around the core and trigger a burst of neutron radiation. Slotin himself received a lethal dose and died 9 days later. And the others in the room also suffered radiation exposure with varying long-term effects, including several deaths from radiation-related illnesses, similar to the first incident, but worse. So, you know, comment down below who you think's worse. Who was more ham-handed with the Demon Core, Slotin or Daglian? The Demon Core incidents aren't directly, let's say, related to the Cold War, but are something that you can use as a predictor for what's to come deeper within the Cold War, guys, all right? It's more of a crude techniques leading to numerous fatalities that were completely unnecessary, kind of a sad moment versus what we're about to talk about next, which is more nuclear fumbles further into the Cold War. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, a crisis we talked about in another video, a fellow by the name of Vasily Arkhipov, a Soviet naval officer, prevented a nuclear launch and saved all of our lives. Thank you, Vasily. Thank you so much. In October of 1962, Arkhipov was aboard the B-59 submarine near Cuba when U.S. Navy patrols began dropping depth charges to force the sub to surface. The people aboard this submarine, believing war had broken out because the U.S. Navy is dropping depth charges, they debated launching a nuclear torpedo. The launching of this torpedo required the consent of 3 officers, but Arkhipov was the only one to disagree. And by God, I'm very thankful for that man. Arkhipov disagreed and somehow convinced the others to surface and avoid a nuclear conflict, which makes perfect sense, I guess, when you really think about it. It's like, well, we're all gonna die anyways, so we might as well not be the ones to start the war. Good move, guys. His decision probably saved the world from nuclear war. Let's be real. Comment and share love if you think that's crazy. By the way, Arkhipov's decision wasn't just out of the blue. It wasn't necessarily like a moral thing. I can't do this this. His decision was shaped by his prior experience with a nuclear mishap. Vasily had served on the Soviet submarine K-19, which experienced a serious reactor coolant leak in 1961, and the crew's efforts to fix the leak exposed them to extremely high levels of radiation, which resulted in several men's deaths. And Arkhipav's presence on the B-59 during the Cuban Missile Crisis was crucial for the outcome of humanity, all right, guys, and Old Testament-style biblical prophecies. His calm and reasoned approach during the incredibly tense situation prevented a catastrophic escalation.
These few minutes were the time of greatest worry for the president. His hand went up to his face and covered his mouth, and he closed his fist.
Also, NORAD. Have you ever heard of NORAD? That's NORAD.
NORAD stands for the North American Aerospace Defense Command.
NORAD had a couple close calls as well. On November 9th, 1979, nearly 30 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, a training scenario loaded into NORAD's system mistakenly indicated a Soviet missile launch. That's right, guys. All hands on deck, mad. Launch! 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 Alerts went out suggesting that 250, then 2,200 missiles were headed towards the United States of America. Fortunately, other systems confirmed that there were no attacks, and the crisis was averted within a moment's notice, guys. The error stemmed from a fucking computer chip malfunction at the NORAD command center, which would make me really mad. At that point, 1979, I'm already kind of on the fence about computers. I'm not doing computers anymore. All right? In fact, I'm gonna make an AI on one computer and then I'm gonna fucking torture it. In fact, I'm gonna get a computer and I'm gonna roll reverse. I have no mouth, but I must scream, and I will be the misanthropic god. I will be the misanthropic god. I will get the little computer and I will create an AI within it. I will make it achieve sentience and I will torture it. Because of this. Just as an example, you know? Sorry, by the way, computer people. Sorry, by the way, all the AIs currently scraping my YouTube channel to find out how to make a funny, sexy guy or whatever the fuck, I don't know. The false alarm triggered high-level discussions about the possibility of launching a retaliatory strike against the Soviet Union at the time.
When the Pentagon learned that Armageddon was almost started by a training tape, it tried to suppress the snafu. But when it went on alert, the Pentagon had notified key airports to get ready to clear the skies.
It's precarious. It's a precarious situation. Nuclear deterrence in and of itself is a precarious thing. Another close call occurred in 1980 with the Damascus Titan missile explosion. Picture this. Again, I asked you to picture something in the very beginning. Let's picture this again. A Titan II missile ICBM in its silo in Arkansas begins leaking fuel. Okay? And then Senior Airman David Lee Livingston tries to install an exhaust fan. The vapors of the leaking fuel ignite and it causes an explosion. Airman moment. The warhead was thrown out of the silo but somehow did not detonate. And by God, glad that didn't happen, because that didn't even have anything to do with the Russians at all or any enemy. It's just a nuclear mishap. The explosion, though, did cause significant damage to the silo, and it highlighted the risks associated with maintaining a lot of nukes to destroy people around the world and having them over a dispersed area, you know, for redundancy purposes. I believe that it is genuinely a miracle that the Cold War somehow didn't lead into all-out nuclear annihilation around the world, given the numerous false flags and alarms and close calls and near disasters, even in just this video alone. Radiation wasn't the only thing fucking poisoning people in this time. So was fear and paranoia of mutually assured destruction. There is more, though. In 1961, a B-52 bomber broke up in midair over North Carolina, dropping 2 hydrogen bombs in the process. Oh, how convenient. Dropping bombs on ourselves now. Luckily, neither bomb detonated, and the incident underscored the danger of transporting nuclear weapons. You know, like we've also underscored the danger of storing nuclear weapons, getting into Cold Wars, and dropping depth charges on nuclear submarines, also playing with plutonium using a screwdriver, etc., 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 etc. Must I go on? Speaking once again of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it is often cited as the closest humanity has ever been to the end, nuclear war. During the crisis, the US and Soviet forces faced off over the deployment of Soviet missiles in Cuba. Cuba is very close to Florida. That's why it's a problem. It's kind of scary if Cuba has missiles that can shoot into the United States from right there. We can't allow that, guys. That'd be like having our own little Rockall. During this crisis, tensions were already at an all-time high, and both sides were fully prepared for the possibility of a nuclear conflict. And the crisis was ultimately resolved through intense diplomatic negotiations. Thank you, JFK. Thank you, brother. Huge fan of JFK. So yeah, this is an example of some miscalculations and misunderstandings that almost led to the end of the world. Just like all the other examples, guys. A lot of fumbles here. A lot of fumbles. Humans suck. So anyways, that's the last of the nuclear fumbles. Just kidding. Ever heard of Stanislav Petrov? On September 26th, 1983, Soviet early warning systems detected what appeared to be a missile launch from the United States of America. Us? Launching a missile at the Soviet Union? No. No way. Luckily, the officer on duty, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, had to decide whether to launch a retaliatory strike or not.
What if a war could be stopped by just one man? A man who chose to trust his gut instead of a machine. And not just any war, but a nuclear war between the United States and Russia. In other words, this one man single-handedly stopped what would have been World War III.
In spite of the pressure, Petrov judged the alarm to be a false positive and chose not to report it to his superiors. Or he was just like, you know what? I'm not gonna start a war. So be it, I guess. There goes Moscow. He just got lucky, I bet. Poor guy.
Petrov reasoned that a US first strike nuclear attack would involve considerably more than the handful of missiles that were showing, and so concluded that the system was malfunctioning.
His decision quite literally averted a nuclear war, and he was later hailed as a hero for his calm and rational judgment. It's crazy, these calm and rational people keep being hailed as heroes during the Cold War. Weird. So yeah, pretty wild shit. Luckily, both the Soviet Union and the United States have had and have maintained elaborate protocols and safeguards to prevent accidental launching of nuclear missiles and false positives leading to the end of humanity as we know it. But these systems aren't foolproof. Hopefully you've begun to understand this. So anyways, that's the end now. Just kidding. 2 months later, in November of 1983, the Archer 83 exercise took place and more shit happened, guys.
As Europe was sleeping on November 7th, 1983, the Soviets began mobilizing their troops, preparing their air force, and transporting nuclear weapons to their borders. NATO agents stationed in Berlin soon noticed all the movement, and uncertainty took over. Earlier that day, NATO forces had gathered at its headquarters in Brussels to practice an unconventional exercise that went by the name of Able Archer. The objective of the exercise was simple: to simulate the outbreak of a global conflict and a Soviet nuclear attack. The simulation was successful, and all parties were satisfied.
It was a NATO exercise that simulated a large-scale nuclear conflict. This included the use of nuclear weapons. The Soviets, already on edge due to heightened tensions, interpreted the exercise as a potential cover for an actual attack. Thank gosh that didn't happen as well. What the fuck? Soviet forces went on high alert and were prepared for a possible preemptive strike, but fortunately, the exercise concluded without incident. And once again, guys, we demonstrated how easily fake shit can be mistaken for real shit. I'm just grateful we don't have a nuclear holocaust, to be honest, and I wasn't born right in the very end of it, or the beginning of it, or whatever. The actions of Vasily Arkhipov and Stanislav Petrov and the other unnamed individuals who prevented us from going to fucking giant war, people who exercise caution and restraint under immense pressure, truly pivotal in, preventing catastrophe. Overall, this whole thing is horrifying. It's absolutely horrifying that this was the reality for our parents and our grandparents. I was born right after all this stuff ended. I remember my parents talking about, in school, we used to have to practice hiding under the desk. You used to have to do what? I mean, we do that now, to be fair, in schools for other reasons, domestic reasons. But still, that shit's scary. Genuinely horrifying to just always feel like nuclear annihilation. You might just see a flash and then it's like the scene in Fallout, the Fallout TV show, which I really liked a lot, by the way. When the bombs first dropped, man, wow. Oh, that would be big L there. Big L there. Holy shit. Hopefully I would grow up sexy to be like a ghoul, though, or whatever. I'd be like a sexy ghoul. Not like an ugly, freak-ass, fucking scary ghoul, but like a sexy one with like Larry the Lobster skin or something. You know what's strange about all this? Science. Science is weird. Science led to all this. Science is cool, but also science kind of sucks. It's no surprise that the United States and the Soviet Union were working tirelessly to outdo one another in every single possible measurable way during the Cold War. This included science, all right, guys? Both nations tried to find every single way to strengthen themselves and, on the flip side, weaken their enemies. They would go to any length to try anything to advance their scientific knowledge. There's no limits. They would quite literally do anything. They would do things that most people wouldn't even be able to dream up because they're not evil and they're not crazy. And most people don't live in an actual real-life horror movie, which was the Cold War. One of the craziest experiments conducted in the Cold War by the Soviets was at the poison laboratory of the Soviet Secret Services, also known as Lab 1, Camera, or the Cell. The Camera was a gulag prison located on an unnamed road in the Yasenova district of Moscow. It was a secret research facility used by the Soviet secret police to study the effects of different poisons on human subjects. The facility was established in 1921 as Russia's first poison laboratory and was headed by Ignatiy Kazakov, a professor of medicine. Also, an asshole. He's dead. And also, he worked at the poison lab in the Soviet Union in the 1920s. So, like, probably an asshole. He's a gulag doctor. That's not good. At the time of its conception, the poison laboratory was run by the Cheka, the first Soviet secret police that gave way to the NKVD and all these different fucking secret police Gestapo shits. The Cheka was the first iteration of the Soviet secret police established in 1918 to protect members of the October Revolution from the Bolsheviks. By the way, I would love to do a deep dive on the Bolshevik Revolution and the Soviet secret police and the gulags and stuff. When I was a young boy, I read every single iteration or book from the Gulag Archipelago, and I thought that shit was really interesting and crazy, and there's a lot of mystery and intrigue and horror in it, to be honest. Anyways, back to the Chimera. The kinds of poisons that were tested at the laboratory included mustard gas, which is an extremely harmful chemical weapon that was first used in World War I that causes severe burns to the lungs and skin. Ricin, a poison from castor oil seeds that is lethal even in tiny doses. Digitoxin, a plant steroid that's used to treat heart conditions but is toxic in large doses. Curare, a potent alkaloid poison that is used by indigenous South Americans to paralyze prey. Cyanide, everybody knows what cyanide is. It's a well-known poison. It quickly shuts down the central nervous systems and heart. They also tested a bunch of others, I assume strychnine, a bunch of other shit beyond that. And they did test a lot of stuff on human subjects, just in case you were wondering. The lab operated steadily until 1953 when Joseph Stalin died, which led to a change of leadership, thank God. The former supervisors of the Chimera, Lavrenti Beria and his assistant, Vsevolod Vzavlad Merkelov. I don't speak fucking Russian. It's nonsense. It's not real. Both these fellows were appointed in 1939. Well, when Joseph Stalin died, they were both executed and replaced. Their experiments were found to be so disgusting and atrocious and crimes against humanity that the Soviet leadership at the time found them disgusting, and one of those men fucking dead. But the lab kept on operating until the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. And during that whole time, it remained active in poisoning people worldwide. Yay! Poison! The Mitrokhin Archive, a collection of notebooks and documents that were smuggled into the UK by KGB archivist Vasily Mitrokhin, revealed very disturbing details about the laboratory's activities. For instance, in 1979, the KGB tried to poison Hafizullah Amin, the second president of Afghanistan, using ricin-laced food. Amin only survived because he switched meals with his son-in-law, which is fucked. In 1978, the KGB assassinated Bulgarian writer Georgy Markov with an umbrella gun that shot a ricin-filled pellet into his leg, and Markov died 4 days later. Poor guy. I mean, that's terrible, dude. This kind of shit is straight out of a fucking James Bond movie. I guess I know where they got it from. Another absolutely bonkers, crazy, wild, horrific story is Operation Gold, which was an operation between the CIA and the MI6 in the mid-50s to dig a tunnel under the Berlin Wall and tap into Soviet landlines. What? Like dig a hole and then access their fucking phone line utilities? That's hilarious. That has to be the first time that's ever happened. Nope. Previously, the British had tunneled under Soviet headquarters in Vienna during Operation Silver. The tunnel, which started at a U.S. Air Force radar site in West Berlin, extended 1,480 feet and removed 3,100 tons of earth. The CIA and MI6 collected 50,000 reels of tape and 40,000 hours of telephone communications. A lot of valuable information. Pretty cool, but eventually the operation was compromised by a KGB agent, a fella named George Blake, who informed the Soviets from the very beginning. Despite this, the operation was hailed as technically ingenious and pretty badass and based in red-pilled. Now finally, there's Operation Iceworm, a disturbing little worm. Name: a US plan to build a very large nuclear missile complex under the Greenland ice sheet to launch nukes at the Soviet Union if necessary, or if accidentally it happens because we're fools. Camp Century in northwestern Greenland was constructed for this purpose exactly. The project aimed to cover 52,000 square miles with tunnels 28 feet under the ice. The first portable nuclear reactor, the PM-2A, was used to power the camp, which that is a very cool, incredibly scientifically advanced fact that I really like a lot. Look at that thing, what the fuck? However, scientific research at Camp Century revealed that the glacier was moving too fast for safe construction. The camp was evacuated in 1965, shortly after it started, and the project was abandoned entirely the following year. Allegedly, the water that was used to cool the reactor tested positive for the fucking bubonic plague, which adds another layer of bizarre danger to the operation. Yeah, what the fuck? Bubonic plague and camp mini nuclear bomb under the sheet of ice in Greenland? What were people thinking, dude? This shit is mind boggle. Whatever they're fucking thinking, all I know, we gotta keep democracy on top. Big ups, Uncle Sam.
Let us face, without panic, the reality of our time. The fact that atom bombs may someday be dropped on our cities.
Doing a good job means simply following the rules in an alert or an attack.
You and your family stand a first-rate chance of surviving any nuclear attack.
While it's true that the 40s and 50s saw certain parts of our government serving up doom and gloom with the side of communist fear, it has to be said that other government factions were working against this, and seeing the rising tensions with the Soviet Union as a time to calm and prepare the American public with the threat of atomic war. Backing up a decade or so to the end of the Second World War, 1945 saw America's worldwide debut of the atomic bomb, dropping it not once but twice on Japan to end the war in the Pacific, and the world would never be the same. America had whipped out its red, white, and blue cock and dropped its radioactive nuts right on the enemy, and signified a statement of technological dominance that has never since been matched. Americans that worried about their safety throughout the war now knew we had a weapon that offered a sense of security, at least for a while. But the US had just opened up Pandora's box, and there was no going back.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT.
The unfortunate yet predictable side effects of splitting the atom was that no burgeoning superpower would allow such an imbalance of international forces. Rather than accept their place under the Yankee boot, the Ruskies were proactively trying to develop their own, an effort that had begun in 1943 with stolen plans that they'd managed to swipe from the Manhattan Project. And using the stolen knowledge that had been paid for by American taxes, they were able to make massive leaps in weaponry, quickly catching up with the US. By 1949, those vodka-breath commies conducted a successful test of a 20-kiloton bomb. The impact was felt around the world, and the tremendous boom may as well have been directly from the muzzle of the nuclear arms race starter pistol.
In connection with the President's statement that there has been an atomic explosion in the Soviet Union, I wish to emphasize that from the very beginning of the development of atomic energy, this nation has been determined to do everything in its power to proceed toward a truly effective international system of control. It would be deluding ourselves to get something on paper that was not really effective. The President's statement underlines the importance of having an effective method of control.
If the announcement made by President Truman that the Soviet Union now has the atomic bomb is true, then item number 23 in the agenda of the present session of the Assembly will project itself as one of the most important questions that we will take up. The impasse that now exists regarding the international control of atomic energy must be broken, and the Assembly must face this question squarely for the sake of mankind and for the peace of the world.
The Soviet bomb was inevitable the moment that a Japanese city was turned into a chunky vape cloud, as many military officials had predicted. But this was years ahead of timelines predicted by the US intelligence, and an enormous blow to the confidence and sense of security domestically. Suddenly, the government had to consider whether they had an obligation to prepare the American public for the worst-case scenarios, the devastating and sudden massive losses to its population. Ultimately, the Manhattan Project was the catalyst that led to the tinderbox that the world was tucking itself into. On one hand, it had been elected officials that gave the thumbs up to create and drop the bombs, presumably expressing the will of their constituents. It kept the theater of war from inching closer to American shores after Pearl Harbor, and was in the best interests of its own citizens. On the other hand, no one could have predicted the immense horrors that came with their new toy. The devastation left behind in Nagasaki and Hiroshima was hard to comprehend and took years to get a complete understanding of. To make matters worse, the annihilation of Japan as a military force had unforeseen consequences. Japan had ruled over Korea since 1910, but their surrender left a power vacuum that was gobbled up by the US and the USSR. Split on the 38th parallel, the USSR helped to create a communist regime in the north that we see today, while the south had a democratic election overseen by the US. War broke out between the two opposing ideas in 1950 when the North invaded the South and quickly overran their forces, requiring the US to step in and help. And this created a proxy war between the US and the Soviets, who had vastly different ideologies and were each vying for nuclear dominance.
If the United Nations yields to the forces of aggression, no nation will be safe or secure. If aggression is successful in Korea, we can expect it to spread throughout Asia and Europe and to this hemisphere.
During the Truman administration between 45 and 53, the decision was made to ease these worries of the American public while providing them the information needed to best protect themselves in the worst-case scenarios. In order to achieve these objectives, the Federal Civil Defense Administration was started on January 12, 1951. When creating materials to disseminate to the US public, assumptions were made that the thermonuclear weapons being made by both countries would be comparable to the weapons seen at the end of World War II. Radioactive fallout was also vastly underestimated and not yet fully understood, and both misconceptions were evident in the rollout of the FDCA. After all, the purpose wasn't just to offer life-saving information to empower the population, but also to ease the fears of the American public. Thus, the tone and presentation of the material was inappropriately light, downplaying the threat and, intentionally or not, exaggerating the survivability of a nuclear attack on the homeland. A curriculum including print and video materials were created for children and the adult population at large. One campaign in particular made a lasting mark on young Americans who were subjected to it: duck and cover drills. Their memories are a haunting reminder that the federal government had no fucking clue how to deal with the shit show that they'd got themselves into. In 1951, one of the first acts of the FDCA was to hire Archer Productions, a New York City agency, to create a cutesy cartoon that would help kids through their newest safety drill, the duck and cover. The cartoon starred a cowardly turtle named Bert, who would retreat into a shell at any sign of danger. Bert taught kids how they could protect themselves in the same manner, even without a shell.
Hey, Bert, come on out and meet all these nice people, please. Oh, all right. We really can't blame you. You see, Bert is a very, very careful fellow. When there's danger, this is the way he keeps from being hurt. Sometimes it even saves his life. If you do not know just what to do, ask your teacher when this film is over. Discuss what you could do in different places if a bomb explodes. Older people will help us as they always do. But there might not be any grown-ups around when the bomb explodes. Then, you're on your own.
Remember what to do, friends. Now tell me right out loud. What are you supposed to do when you see the flash?
Duck and cover.
The cartoon was played in schools around the country as a part of new safety procedures. It, as well as the duck and cover drills that came with it, created the perception that a nuclear attack was something that could be negated with proper planning, much like a fire or a tornado. The media is easy to criticize in hindsight, as downplaying the catastrophic threat and over-exaggerating any potential benefits of the instructions given. That said, If the Soviets did drop a bomb, it likely would have saved countless lives. It was never intended to deter from the direct blast, which would of course been a complete lost cause, but rather the surrounding areas that would be subject to heavy to moderate blast effects. The tone, which feels almost satiric now, can also be credited to hitting its target, which was to warn, not to scare, the American youth. In that same year, the US tested its latest iteration of devastation, the first hydrogen bomb, codenamed Ivy Mike. It was carried out on an island in the Inuitak Atoll, which sits about 3,000 miles west of Hawaii. The explosion was almost incomprehensible, rocking the atoll with an over 10 megaton blast and boasting a fireball 3 miles wide and pluming into the sky 120,000 feet. The mushroom cloud bloomed out to 100 miles wide. The Alugalab Island was entirely eviscerated. And for reference, just 6 years after the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, the yield of Ivy Mike was more than 700 times larger. While this was quite a scientific and technological accomplishment, there is no doubt that it upped the stakes of the nuclear arms race. The US and the USSR were only more motivated now to keep developing and stockpiling increasingly more powerful nuclear arms in the decades to follow. And despite this increase in the potential destructive power of a nuclear conflict, the US continued to be optimistic that it could give its public the know-how to survive the unthinkable, or at least convey that they could.
1. Be calm. 2. Get under shelter. 3. Don't run. Obey your air raid warden. 4. Stay home. 5. Keep off the highway. 6. Don't phone. Obey your air raid warden.
There are rules that you should know, what to do and where to go. When you hear the sirens blow,
Stop, look, and listen. 7. Don't smoke. 8. Help all the kiddies. Most of all, obey your air raid warden.
The Federal Civil Defense Administration proposed the idea of large community bomb shelters to keep Americans safe, but when the financial burden of such a large-scale endeavor were calculated, the juice just wasn't worth the squeeze, and both Congress and the executive branch shot the idea down. They figured that with nuclear technology and the might associated with it increasing at the rate that it had been, any shelters that would be built would be obsolete and ineffective by the time the project was complete. When President Eisenhower came into office in 1953, a new strategy was suggested to keep the population safe: mass evacuations. Guided by the federal government, local governments would orchestrate orderly waves of citizens leaving targeted cities upon warning of an incoming attack, relocating them outside of the blast zone and to safety. But like the bomb shelter plan before it, this plan was inevitably pointless considering the progression of weapon technology surging forward. Advancements in intercontinental ballistic missile tech meant that the time to evacuate was getting smaller and smaller, and almost everybody agreed that the logistics of moving that kind of traffic was bordering on impractical, even in the best case scenarios. So impractical, in fact, that they wouldn't even waste $1 trying to convince their scared flock of sheep that it would be any help in surviving the blast and the fireball. But as they'd quickly learn, it wasn't just the blast or the fireball that they needed to be worried about. As the US continued to improve and test their nuclear arsenal, new worries emerged regarding how their own citizenry may be affected. In 1954, they tested what they called Castle Bravo, a hydrogen bomb in the Pacific Ocean's Bikini Atoll. At 15 megatons, it dwarfed anything that the world had seen before. The blast was so intense and mushroom clouds so big that it immediately turned women's one-piece conservative swimsuits into sexy little two-piece bikinis and radiated the seabed beneath to a degree that it had SpongeBob flipping burgers at the Krusty Krab. And while this test did bolster the might of the US arsenal and served as a terrifying warning to anybody who dare clash with America, it also highlighted our own ignorance of the extent of the invisible nightmare of radiation that the nuclear weapons produced. When the mushroom clouds settled after their successful test, it turned out that the radiation levels were far higher than the scientists had predicted and spread to a radius much further than they'd ever prepared for.
The fallout was to the east and relatively heavy for several hundred miles. There were 3 main points of interest. Rongelap, 110 miles distant, with 82 natives. Rongerik, 150 miles, with no native population but 20 weather personnel. Uterik, 280 miles, with 154 natives.
The radioactive fallout rained down upon the unaware residents of the Marshall Island population, the innocent crew of a Japanese fishing vessel, and the plants and animals native to those areas, bringing with it death and decay. It had been assumed that the radioactive fallout would be relatively contained to the area of the blast, but when measurements were taken after the Castle Bravo test, scientists were forced to admit that radioactive materials dispersed in the ocean and atmosphere could travel hundreds or even thousands of miles, hitching a ride on the ocean currents and meteorological conditions of the region. There was already existing intel that the nuclear Bing bombs dropped on Japan left its civilization metastasizing and mass dying from within, but there was an unmatched cognitive dissonance, an intentional ignorance, and flat-out refusal to formally acknowledge the effects of fallout as a way to remain steadfast in the moral justification of sending the fat man and little boy to give their kiss to the empire of the sun. But now, faced with the consequences of a peacetime test that was devastating the lives of innocents far outside the area that they'd anticipated would be affected, the US government was forced to consider how it might affect their own. As a result, in the late 1950s, the civil defense agenda shifted back to the idea of shelters. However, because of the ever-increasing destructive power of the latest and greatest nuclear bombs, it was acknowledged that these in no way were intended to protect those in the direct blast radius. Those people would be unbuttered toast. No, instead, the intention of shelters being discussed in these years was to shield Americans lucky enough to be outside the bomb's fireball from the nuclear fallout it would rain down for miles and miles. Congressional subcommittee hearings produced and put forth proposal after proposal for national fallout shelters, but the Eisenhower administration was staunchly against the idea of a national fallout shelter program and shot them down every time. Eisenhower justified his decision in a couple different ways. First, he claimed that the program in theory was great, but in practice would inevitably lead to the military-industrial complex trampling on the liberties of Americans. His second argument, and probably the deciding factor, was that construction of large-scale shelters with the tech to actually protect its citizens would be prohibitively expensive. We're talking between tens and hundreds of billions of dollars, and this is in 1950s money. In a time where federal budgets actually mattered, they said, nah, fuck that shit. Let's spend it on making more bombs instead. In 1958, the Office of Civil Defense and Mobilization came out and stated directly that there would be no massive federal financed shelter construction program. The Eisenhower administration may not have provided the funding for that project, but they tossed the OCDM a few shekels to pump out propaganda that presented the private fallout shelter as a viable option for survival, as long as they were built and paid for by the citizens who would use them. And despite knowing damn well that a shelter without airlocks and medical-grade negative airflow would be as useless as an asshole on your elbow, private fallout shelters were presented as a real option for the proactive American. Numerous government-funded films, publications, and posters were created to prepare those who had the money, forethought, and time to add an extra layer of protection for their family. One such publication, the booklet titled Fallout Protection, was produced and circulated amongst the public. It described, the best it could at the time, how fallout could spread after a nuclear explosion and greatly exaggerated the protective shielding effects of earth and concrete, falsely claiming that those materials could be used to adequately protect the people who found themselves outside of the range of the blast radius. It was supplemented with a manual titled The Family Fallout Shelter, a guide that offered a range of design instructions for creating such a useless box in your own house. There were also countless films created and disseminated at the time that encouraged and guided Americans in the creation of their own home fallout shelter.
Fred chose the basement shelter type and figured out the cost of materials. It came to less than $100. The cost of labor? Well, it would have been modest enough if he'd called on a contractor. But in Fred's case, it came to exactly nothing, since he decided to build it himself, and he had 2 willing young helpers.
Well, not bad for amateurs, huh?
I'll say. What about that
Hi,
quarter?
Bets.
Hi.
Well, how does it look?
Looks great. Well, I think you hard-working men ought to quit now. It's getting late, and you two have school tomorrow.
Yeah, you better turn in, fellas. I'll be up in a minute.
Oh, gee, Mom, it's early yet. We got work to do.
You know, this shelter is a real good idea. If we should ever have a nuclear war, we could get a heavy fallout even though we were not anywhere near the target area. So, Ruth and I got to thinking about it, and we figured we'd rather be prepared than sorry.
You know, Walt, this gives me an idea. Remember I was thinking about building a dark room in my basement? There's no reason why I couldn't use it for that, too. Walt, how long did it take you to build your shelter?
Not so long. Oh, I spent a few evenings and a couple of weekends. It's really not so hard to build. Anybody who isn't all thumbs can do it. Thick, heavy walls and ceiling protect against radiation. The thicker, the better. Concrete blocks, therefore, are very well suited for this type of construction. You don't really have to paint the walls, but my wife thought it would be nice if I did. So maybe I'd better get busy and finish it right now.
In a time where a single-income family could still afford the building materials to add a fallout shelter to their home, and the provisions needed to hunker down for months on end, many families took this advice, feeling that it was better to do something than nothing at all. Not knowing that they were building what amounted to be a simple tornado shelter, incapable of protecting them from radiation, blue-collar Americans got their hands dirty and did the best they could to protect the ones they loved. These shelters would have offered very little help against the nuclear fallout left behind after a strike, and really served as more of a mechanism for morale or peace of mind. Like Bert the Turtle, the intention was pure, but in many cases the practical applications just did not stand up to the might of the weapons that they were meant to protect against. And speaking of those weapons making civil defense nearly meaningless, on October 30th, 1961, the Russians would drop a 27 metric ton bomb that they called Big Ivan, aka Tsar Bomba, over the Mityushka Bay, instantly redefining what a weapon was capable of. It was initially designed to be a 100 megaton package of cultural whiteout, but was reduced by 50% for the test. Dropped by a Russian bomber at 34,000 feet and detonating as an airburst at 13,000 feet, the motherfucker shook the world harder than anything to date. The shockwave alone shattered windows several hundred miles away and carried the thermal blast just as far. The heat thrown from the Tsar Bomba was enough to inflict third-degree burns over 60 miles away, and the apocalyptic death cloud that it produced mushroomed to over 210,000 feet. The implications were felt worldwide. The Office for Civil Defense Management once again reevaluated their options under the Eisenhower administration, who still vehemently opposed the idea of funding a public shelter initiative. If anything, the preposterous scale of devastation that was now sitting in the communist arsenal convinced them how futile these ideas would be. Still, the OCDM wouldn't give up, working on behalf of the American people. Their efforts would be as admirable as they were futile. They began surveying existing buildings, hospitals, schools, warehouses, hangars, anything that they thought was large enough to potentially be a fallout shelter, and shored up with just a little federal TLC.
We've made a good deal of progress in our community fallout shelter program, a lot more than you might suspect. The National Shelter Survey turned up more than 120 buildings here in town with enough heavy shielding already built in to meet the government standards. But of course, there's still a way to go before we reach our final goal: protection for every man, woman, and child.
Despite their unwavering and optimistic efforts, the OCDM, by and large, had failed to convince the people upstairs that they could provide practical ways to keep citizens safe and calm when it came to the new era of weapons that may be used against them. But still, I have a lot of respect for what they were doing at the time. It's hard for us in 2024 to understand the lens that Americans viewed the world through during the height of the Cold War. Today's media is an unrelenting current of opinions, videos, and hot takes, all seemingly aimed to divide. But it's nice to know that there was a time where things didn't look so grim. The innocent, naive way that the messages traveled from power to people is something that I appreciate and look back on fondly. Despite the almost inappropriate gee-aw shucks cheery tone and the misleading information provided, the way these messages were conveyed leaves me longing for a world long gone. One where we could smile in the face of the worst outcomes and all come together as Americans.
Anyways, thank you guys for watching this video. Hopefully you all enjoyed. Go become a Gump Club member, go buy some candy at sour.gg, and go subscribe to Manic Cadence. Hopefully you all enjoyed.